Martin Carter. Now, I was telling you about the importance of viewing Martin Carter, certainly of reading his work within the context of the protest tradition. And it's very important to note that this notion of the West Indian protest tradition has been written about quite a bit over the decades. There are critics that talk about the protest tradition within the literary sphere, and in that context they will certainly quote, they will certainly mention names of people like Claude McKay as being a forerunner within this protest tradition. And I suppose if you are seeing it in that way, you might also want to suggest that there is a writer like George Lamming who also follows within this tradition and whose voice represents one of the most radical perspectives within the evolution of West Indian literature. So there's this protest tradition which we talk about in the literary context, the literary context, as Kamal Brathwaite would call it. But then you could also talk about the protest tradition within wider Caribbean cultural sphere, within indeed the oral tradition. And in that context, I think it's important that we consider also, and that we have in mind at least when we read, the sense in which Martin Carter can be connected to the oral poets, in particular the Calypsonians, and the way in which his fervent political protest certainly has been in practice by Calypsonians before, but also since then. So you might see individuals, Sparrow and the like, as somehow fitting within this tradition. And then in the wider context too of reggae, perhaps we could trace Martin Carter's work and the protest tradition through the works of someone like Bob Marley, but also perhaps even more so through the work of what used to be called the dub poets, or the performance poets of the 1970s, 1980s. I'm talking of people like Muta Baruka, Linton Kwesi Johnson, and the like. University of Hunger. This poem is certainly one of the most popular Martin Carter pieces. It has received quite a number of critiques, appraisals over the decades. And one appraisal that comes to mind is the article by A.J. Seymour, which is called A Commentary on Two Poems. And there he talks about this poem, places it within its historical context, but also within the wider geopolitical context. He says of this poem that the title gives us a lead into the poem. Hunger here is the desire for necessary things to feed the body, mind, and spirit, a desire that is not met and that becomes therefore a deprivation. It is a third world feeling expressed against the developed countries, and at the same time it is also partly the expression of people who live in slums and ghettos in developed countries. It is a poem with the spirit of trade union protest in it, and therefore it penetrates and transcends bland socialist theory. And this reading by A.J. Seymour is an important one, because it helps us to begin to understand the poem beyond the mere context in which Martin Carter was writing. But apart from that, I think some of the important things we have to note in this poem would have to do with the reference to the naming of it, the University of Hunger, which certainly captures our imagination. It's important that he uses the metaphor of the university to explore the quest by himself, by individuals of his generation, but also by so-called third world, maybe radicals or nationalists like himself, who have had to become vocal in the face of colonialist and imperialist aggression. So the poem then explores a rite of passage, explores a process of movement. Significantly, makes references to a pilgrimage, suggestive of movement and suggestive of process and perhaps passage and rite of passage. But some of the things that we also have to consider would be the way in which the poem begins. I think it is certainly very important. It does not give us, it begins with the word is, it, which is implied, is not there. And it's important because this reference and this way of speaking is, arguably reflective of the Caribbean Creole and a number of Caribbean Creole. And he uses this to a potent effect because what he does center here is perhaps not the university itself, but the action and the act of that is involved in the process of wanting to learn, so that the it, which would be the university, is somehow it's not there. He does not utter it. He does not give it to us. It is implied, and because the verb itself is up front, we are called to pay more attention, I think, to the action and to the movement and to the passage and the pilgrimage that he certainly is exploring in this poem. So, very simply, we could see that this poem has to do then with the desire of the radical, the desire of the deprived, the desire of the underprivileged, the desire of those individuals who are victims of state, victims of oppression, victims, certainly in this case, of colonialist aggression and so on. And the poem therefore traces the process and the desire for knowledge, the desire for truth, the desire for indeed justice and for liberation and freedom. And it does so then through a carefully well-wrought set of verses where the poet makes use of repetition, very prevalent. Also the simile, very, very important here in this poem as well. And then you also have the kind of a lament as well, which pervades the poem really. So there is a sense of movement, but this movement is not rapid and swift. There's something methodical about it. There's something systematic about it, and I think that sense of rhythm is somehow conveyed through the repetition of key words, repetition certainly of, there's a refrain which also ends this poem. These are very, very important things to note that Martin Carter is crafting really, I think, very effectively in this poem. But also, I think we must consider the way in which throughout the poem, as in other poems, how he pays a lot of attention to the land, to landscape, and he uses it to potent effect. You'll notice that there are images of trees, of rivers, certainly of the landscape. And those of you who know of Guyana will know of the power of Guyanese topography. And certainly other Guyanese writers, most particularly Wilson Harris, would have made very, very effective use of the power of Guyanese landscape to propel his work, and certainly to give his work added depth and meaning and so on. So, as in other poems, and as we noted in a couple of the other poems we have looked at, there is an interesting relationship between human beings and the landscape, and features of the landscape, features of nature. And to the extent that Martin Carter wants us to recognize the sense of unity that there is between this society that he writes about, the society in which he's placed, and its peoples, and the sense in which their union, the union between land and character, places these individuals and landscape in opposition to those individuals who are imposing forces, in this case the British. So the University of Hunger then is a metaphor for the desire of fulfillment, the desire of freedom, the desire for liberation, and the desire for fuller knowledge. But what we get as we go through the poem, you notice, if you go, for example, from the first stanza, the reference to the pilgrimage, very important. It's the pilgrimage of man, the long march. And you should pay attention to the fact that Martin Carter, though he's writing within a particular context, his poetry has much, much, much wider, implications and application. And it is so because there's a bit of philosophizing in this, there's a bit, perhaps you would say too, of the kind of political rhetoric and of the grandstanding. You might say so, but this is the nature of protest poetry. This is the nature of protest literature, that it is able to, to overflow the boundaries within which and go beyond the boundaries within which it is actually created, and to mean something as well, and to have effective import in other cultural contexts. And this is why I think Martin Carter is such an important poet, because he's writing about his own troubles and tribulations, so to speak. But his poems are also positioning the underdog in opposition to the other, in opposition, in this case, to colonial rulers. So notice the movement then within the poem, how the individuals who are coming as though they're coming to a pilgrimage, as though they're going to find a place where they're going to worship at an altar of some kind, where they're going to find this university. And this university isn't to be found and located in one space. You don't feel so. You feel as though Martin Carter is creating this notion of university as a signifier of enlightenment. And this enlightenment does not magically come, with the snap of a finger. So that we get the sense of movement of individuals who are moving in the second stanza. They come treading in the hoof marks of the mule, passing the ancient bridge, the grave of pride, the sudden flight, the terror and the time. They come from the distant village of the flood, passing from middle ear to middle earth in the common hours of nakedness. There's something grand about this poem, there's something grand about what is happening. And I think that the grandeur too has to do with the fact that the protagonists here, the subjects, are nameless. They're called they. And the fact that they're coming from a place, coming from a location, means that they have a history as signified here. There's reference to the march as somehow taking place within some really grand, perhaps mythical space, middle ear to middle earth. But then also note how images of darkness and images of the power of landscape, how they engulf the poem, and how these individuals who are marching, they're marching within a context, within a historical context. Notice some references to history, but they're also marching within a geopolitical space and an arena. So they come in long lines toward the broad city. Is the golden moon like a big coin in the sky? Is the floor of bone beneath the floor of flesh? Is the beak of sickness breaking on the stone? Oh, long is the march of men, and long is the life, and wide is the span. And we have that refrain again, which signifies, as it is, repeated, it signifies the ongoing nature of this quest. It signifies that this march does not end really. And some people might suggest that the poem really is a dirge, and its outlook really is bleak. I'm not sure myself. I'm thinking that this is the kind of poem that explores, the philosophical subject of enlightenment and of the quest for knowledge, the quest for freedom, the quest for liberation, the quest for, if you might say, truth. And as such, these are universal concepts, and these are concepts that are not easy to grasp, and these are enduring quests. So in a sense, Martin Carter's poem, if you analyze it within that, that framework, then you do not feel that it is really bleak and pessimistic. You feel that it is only being realistic in its outlook about life itself, and about some of the concepts, some of the notions, some of the precepts, if you may, certainly some of the themes of our lives and of humankind and our existence on earth. So all in all then, I would suggest that we look at this poem as one of Martin Carter's more philosophical pieces, and this poem I think anticipates his later poems that are going to come a little later on after the poems of resistance, when he becomes much more philosophical. Indeed, I suggest that, he doesn't suddenly become philosophical after poems of resistance and in the wintertime and so on, but that indeed there are already in his earlier poems, these streaks of the kind of philosophizing that he does. So University of Hunger explores then the universality of oppression, universality of the need for liberation, and indeed it also in some respects anticipates the independence period and the question of if or institutions or educational institutions themselves will be able to provide us with the knowledge that we need to confront the opposition, and more importantly, to propel our societies to greater development and to greater fulfillment and so on. And this poem, therefore, is a very powerful poem, and we have to consider it within these particular contexts. I come from the nigger yard. If in the poem University of Hunger we wonder about the individuals who are marching on this pilgrimage of life towards a location, towards advancement of some kind, if we wonder who these individuals are, then perhaps the poem I Come from the Nigger Yard gives us some insight into the kinds of individuals who are engaged in the struggle, who are engaged in the pilgrimage and in the journey that Martin Carter presents us with in University of Hunger. And the quest motif is very important, certainly, within West Indian literature. In Martin Carter's work, I think we can talk of the quest motif within the context of the relationship or the contestation between the colonizer and the colonized. We can certainly talk of the kind of ideological tensions and how they play out. So there's an actual process that we are able to view in Martin Carter's poem, because we wonder about the outcome of his poetry and about his final state and so on, and if indeed he and his people will see liberation. But then there are also other kinds of quests. The journey motif therefore also takes place within the psyche, within the mind space, so to speak. And if we are concerned with the fact of history, if we are concerned with what will happen to Guyana in the 1950s, and what will happen after the suspending of the constitution, and what will happen in the independence period and the post-independence period, that is one concern. But I suggest to you that we also have to pay attention to the mindscape. I think this is very important within Carter's poetry, the extent to which he's exploring freedom and liberation, also too as important individual human quests and desires and rights. So the poem I Come from the Nigger Yard, arguably, it gives us further insight into the kinds of individuals who are engaged in the pilgrimage that we encounter then in University of Hunger. And the speaking voice here declares, I come from the nigger yard of yesterday, leaping from the oppressor's hate and the scorn of myself. And certainly, that refrain will be uttered again. The importance of the nigger yard then to this poem is that it gives us some sort of grounding in the, if you may, the cultural, socio-political realities of Caribbean culture, and this notion of the yard, very important within West Indian literature. Those of you who have read works by C.L.R. James, you certainly would have read something by Brother Man by Roger Mays. These are works, certainly C.L.R. James's Minty Alley. These are works that are set within the yards, and these yards are, if you may, plantation spaces which certainly continue to be inhabited by ex-slaves and they are marked by, squalor and poverty and so on. So that the writers who are setting their work within the context of the yard are doing so to explore the realities of the hardships of Caribbean society, but they're also doing this as a way of calling our attention to the fact that history, doesn't ever leave us. We're always seeming to have to come back to history and to the realities of its effects on our current society. So Martin Carter then also foregrounds this notion of the yard, and he uses it as a signifier then of poverty and of deprivation, but also he uses it as a starting point for understanding the necessity for transformation and change and freedom, and the kinds of themes that he explores really in the collection itself. So the history of slavery is important, the history of oppression is important, and it's significant that Martin Carter in this poem reconnects with that very history of enslavement to suggest indeed that, and to ask the question rather, has it really ended? Because certainly with the role of the British in Guyana in the 1950s, he himself and others of his generation, Chetty Jagan, are actively engaged in the process of seeking redress, seeking liberation, seeking freedom, seeking quote-unquote independence. So in the poem then, we have a sense of knowing who the individuals are rather, who are engaged and who are en route in this pilgrimage. These are individuals who have a history of oppression, individuals who have a history of slavery, and as he says in stanza 3, it was me always walking in the bare feet, meeting strange faces like those in the dreams of fever, when the whole world turns upside down and no one knows which is the sky or the land, which heart is his among the torn or wounded, which face is his among the strange and terrible, walking about groaning between the wind. Again, notice the presence of the land, the landscape, the power of the landscape, imagery. His images are certainly rooted in his nation, in the natural world, and these become as well, sounding boards for the realities of the human condition. There's something very grand about the poems, Yes, rooted in nature, but also the references to sky, references to wind, and it is as though we cannot understand the individuals unless we get a sense of the location of where they are from, and who they are very much has to do in Martin Carter's work with where they are from. So as the poem develops then, we are given further insights into the individuals, the subjects, and the speaking voices within the poem. And in a sense, we are given insight into Martin Carter, the poet himself, and how he sees himself. One question you will want to pose, though, would be, to what extent is the poet claiming, is he claiming too much? Can he indeed harness the support of an entire society? Are others seeing it his way? Is the poet in some ways over dramatizing his own incarceration? And is this not the methodology of activists? And is he successful in this? These are questions, and to what extent are these really personal poems that only have, serious import for him, but that are not certainly taken up in the same way in the wider society? That is a question you would ask yourself, but I suspect you might conclude that the poet's role is not so much to worry about what will happen thereafter, but to write the poems and to convey the truths as he or she sees them. So as the poem develops, and as it page 63, we get to the penultimate stanza, in which, if I read, until today, in the middle of the tumult, when the land changes and the world's all convulse, when different voices join to say the same and different hearts beat out in unison, where on the aching floor of where I live, the shifting earth is twisting into shape, I take again my nigger life, my scorn, and fling it in the face of those who hate me. It is me, the nigger boy, turning to manhood, linking my fingers, welding my flesh to freedom. As though somehow, the speaking voice here, the poet himself, has come to some recognition, has grown, and this growing and this development rather has to do with the fact of having gone through the whole set of processes that are listed out in the earlier stanzas. And then the last stanza then repeats, the first stanza, I come from the nigger yard of yesterday, leaping from the oppressor's hate and the scorn of myself. But then of course it changes afterwards, as though to give the poem and to give the conclusion its own signature, and to signify as well that the poem, though there's some repetition and though there is some repeating of notions and of concepts and of images, that there is development. I think that is marked by the fact of the difference between the first stanza and the last stanza. So that is something you would want to consider very carefully, how these two stanzas, how they square up, how they relate and how they are different. So it says, I come to the world with scars upon my soul, wounds on my body, fury in my hands. I turn to the histories of men and the lives of the peoples. I examine the shower of sparks, the wealth of the dreams. I am pleased with the glories and sad with the sorrows, rich with the riches, poor with the loss. From the nigger yard of yesterday I come with my burden. To the world of tomorrow I turn with my strength. Again, question, what is the mood of this piece? How does it impact you? Are his poems too tense, too tightly wound? Is there too much emotion? Is he preaching a bit too much here in these poems? Is there something of over dramatization, in these poems? These are all questions. But what we have to do, I think one thing we have to do is to think contextually of when they were written, and to ask ourselves, how applicable are these poems to us today? And that is a significant question. Are these poems really poems that were meant for the independence period within the region and the post-independence, early post-independence period? Are these poems certainly that have significance beyond then? Are these poems out of sync with, current geopolitical realities? Is this poem dated? Terribly dated? These are questions you ask ourselves. Or are the issues that he presents here universal and enduring issues? And what vision did he have for Guyana? And, what is the state of Guyana today? And perhaps that is not the best of ways of talking about his poems, comparing his vision with what is today, and then to somehow say that his vision was just that, a vision. Because I think the reality is that most poets who were writing in the independence period, many poets who were writing then from the region, and certainly outside of the region as well, they had a particular viewpoint which from their vantage point was important. So how important then are these poems? Is this poem? And is Martin Carter useful to us today? Can he teach us anything about ourselves and about our societies? And I think these, among other things, are important considerations for us as we continue to look at the work of Martin Carter.